So they did not feel that the government should be regulating religious practice in any sort of way, even if they might have agreed that people should be focused on religious activities on Sundays. Right? So the idea of, focusing on religious activities and giving up secular activities was something that a lot of restorationists would have believed in, supported, but not to the point of legislating against it or trying to justify it through use of the Sabbath. And so Campbell argued especially that Sabbath laws were the first step toward establishing a national church, which he did not feel was appropriate under the Constitution or under the New Testament. There was also concern that some of the minority groups, and we talked about this before, like Jews and Seventh-day Baptists, people that actually worshiped on Saturday, that they would be adversely affected by these laws. And so there's a concern for religious minorities here as well. So there's a variety of reasons why a lot of the early disciples would not have supported Sabbath Reform. Again, they do support some of the ideas, right? And there are frequent discussions about people not being committed to religious observances on Sunday. They did not. People don't focus on their responsibilities on Sunday, and those kind of things. But they didn't want legislation to try and make a change in that regard. By the 1840s and 50s, however, more and more northern leaders, those that are tending towards the disciples of Christ's side, are more supportive of legislation. So they are becoming more supportive of political involvement in this religious sphere. And so again, just another one of those places where you see this division taking place along these kind of regional lines, these class lines. A fifth issue coming up in all of this has to do with marriage and divorce. Divorce in the 19th century was largely uncommon. It did not take place frequently in general. But especially among the frontier, there were a lot of people involved in various forms of sexual immorality. And so those marital problems, those sins did exist, but divorce was uncommon. Some early Christians, those coming from the Stone side of the movement, tended to even discourage marriage to an unbeliever. And so there's not only a concern about divorce, there's also the idea that that unbelievers shouldn't get married, that a Christian shouldn't marry an unbeliever. In some places, you can be subject to church discipline for it, meaning that if you married an unbeliever, the church could exclude you from membership. However, a lot of churches didn't do that. I mean, they discouraged it, but they didn't actually exclude anybody from membership. For a lot of people, a marriage was scriptural if it was according to the laws of the land. Right? People that were eligible to be married, that were married in appropriate ways, and their marriage was recognized by the state. Divorce, on the other hand, although it was uncommon, was to be practiced according to Matthew 19, where the only exception for breaking the marital bond outside of death was sexual immorality, that one of the partners had engaged in some sort of inappropriate sexual behavior, like adultery. There were some Northerners, more liberal, who also included desertion, which was, again, common, especially on the frontier, where the husband would just desert the wife. Sometimes it happened the other way around, where the wife would desert the husband and kids. But for some people, it's only 1919, right? fornication, sexual immorality. That's the only reason you can divorce somebody. For Northerners, they also included desertion. Right? So if your spouse abandoned you, you could scripturally get remarried as well. The last thing I want to talk about with respect to this issue of moral reform has to do with the ideas of how is this to take place. And we've touched on some of this already. Southern sectarians, right, those that tended to be more separate from society, those that tend to be less politically active, argued that the church was the sole source of moral authority and reform. And so any sort of moral reform should be an outgrowth of the church, not from either the government or any sort of organization outside of the congregation. For these Southerners that tend to be more conservative, the key to reforming the world was evangelism. It was not being active in social issues, being active politically. It was society will become more Christian when we convert people to Christianity. And so conversion and evangelism was more of the focus than any sort of organized political or reform activity. Northern liberals, however, were the exact opposite. Not that they denied the importance of evangelism, but that they encouraged or supported the idea that you could be involved in moral reform crusades and societies that were developing in the larger American culture, like the temperance movement, like abolitionist groups, like prison reform groups. A lot of those will be mentioned in the Benevolent Empire. Those were things that Northerners felt they could be a part of. And even though they were kind of para-denominational, they were larger than the church or were separate from the church, there was the belief that it was okay for you to be, as a Christian, be involved in those societies, that especially those ones that had religious goals or religious purposes, which most of them did at the time. So, not only did the slavery show us that there are these developing cracks in the Restorationist movement, we're also seeing that as reform is such a big part of American culture in the 19th century, there are also these divisions and cracks that are taking place in the Restoration movement over how to bring about reform, what reform consists of, and what is necessarily sinful and not. The Civil War, of course, played a substantial role in deepening those divisions. But again, those divisions are things that are already starting when the Civil War takes place. And again, the official recognition of these two groups doesn't take place until the 20th century, but this is taking place throughout the 19th. Another one of the issues that is also putting pressure on the Restoration movement has to do with Christian support of warfare, especially related to any sort of national cause.
Are we post-Civil War now?
No, this is still pre-Civil War.
Okay.
Yeah. So we've kind of backed up a little bit, kind of talk about how does the Restoration movement experience some of those things that we talked about in the 19th century. Yeah, we're a little bit off the outline now. We've taken, I've ended up talking more about some issues than I thought we were originally going to take. We're in the this kind of crisis and division aspect, so we're off the outline a little bit, but we'll still get to everything. But it turned out, I mean, this is the first time I've taught this class, so it turned out that I'm taking a little bit longer on some things. I thought, we'll just need one class on that. No, we actually need two classes on that. So next time I teach it, I'll revise the calendar a little bit.
Okay, it's like you've been teaching it for years.
So when it came to this issue of Christian support of warfare, either as being a soldier or just supporting our country's involved in the war, and so should I be supportive of that or not? There were, in the larger American culture, there were a variety of peace societies that developed in the United States after the War of 1812. And so throughout the 19th century, there were a few people, never got really huge, but people that supported the idea of taking a pacifist approach. Alexander Campbell, Stone were pacifists. Campbell, in his various periodicals, would reprint articles from people, peace reformers, and others. Barton W. Stone was also someone that was pacifist. He believed, for example, that war alongside of slavery were two great evils in American society and just in existence. During the war with Mexico in the 1840s, you begin to see some of this division between people that are supportive of this war and people that are pacifists or are not supportive of this war. Largely, those that were pacifists about the war or were condemnatory of the war tended to be in the Northeast. They were not people that lived in those regions that were under context, right? And so they're not people that live in Texas, they're not people that live in the Southwest. Those people tended to be supportive of the war, especially those that were American citizens living in those areas. Campbell, in kind of continuing his pacifism, emphasized the example of Jesus and encouraged people to recognize that the example of Jesus, the kingdom of Jesus, was not of this world. So, for him, Christians should not be involved in warfare. Walter Scott, another one of those 19th century leaders we've talked about, he too took a more pacifistic stance. He actually encouraged people that they should express and experience empathy for the enemy, kind of recognizing the humanness of it. On the other hand, there were members of the Restoration movement that were supportive of the war. They participated in it. Some of those even saw the war as a Christian war. Although a lot of people in Mexico were Catholics, so that too shows some anti-Catholicism of recognizing, oh, that's not a Christian movement. There's a sizable group of Latinos now that are turning to Pentecostalism, especially immigrants. But yeah, there's still a rather sizable number of people in Mexico and South America that are still Catholic.
Those are the ones coming to the United States.
A lot of those that are coming to the United States, but even some that are still in Mexico and South America, because there's Pentecostals and Charismatics have been very active in missionary efforts in Central and South America, and so it's a rather growing group. There were some debates in the Restoration movement over this issue. For both sides, one of the issues that they tried to use was the question of Cornelius. Cornelius, of course, we're introduced to in Acts 10, and introduced to him as a centurion, someone in the Roman army. So the one side tried to use Cornelius and said, certainly, once Cornelius was baptized and became a follower of Jesus, he would have had to have given up his commission as a soldier in the Roman army. Others said, well, maybe not. Maybe Cornelius shows us that Christians could be soldiers. Cornelius' situation is problematic because it doesn't tell us what he did. Right? I mean, it ends with his baptism and the baptism of his household, but then doesn't tell us what he did one way or the other. So to use him anyway doesn't really fly. On the other hand, it probably would have been very, very difficult for a Roman centurion to simply resign his commission. It's not the same as what you have with a volunteer army like today, where you have a little bit more flexibility about, resigning your commission. So I think Cornelius was a little bit of a complicated issue. So I don't, it was very problematic to try and use that. But I mean, there are not many other passages in the New Testament that talk about soldiers. The only other one, as far as actual soldiers, there are certainly passages that talk about how Christians are like soldiers or are engaged in spiritual warfare. But you have Cornelius, and then you have the soldiers that come to John the Baptist and ask him what they should do. And John tells them to accept their wages, and not oppress anybody. He doesn't tell them not to be soldiers. Would be another place where you could kind of argue a little bit one way or the other. So, essentially, most of the leaders of the Restoration movement appear to have been moderate pacifists up to the Civil War, even though there were a lot of other members of the group that were supportive of a variety of different wars and actually participated as soldiers. So it's not a clear one side or the other. You do have this kind of division. And here, too, you also have some slightly divisions on regional lines, but not as extensive as some of the other issues we've looked at, which leads us into talking then about the Civil War. One of the clearest things about the Civil War is that those early leaders that are still alive at this point push for that no matter what happens, the movement needs to remain united. North and South, disciples, Christians, whatever we're going to call each other, we need to remain united. We cannot divide over the issue of civil war. So Campbell certainly encouraged people in the North. He encouraged the North and South. How many people were actually reading this journal, of course, but he's trying to convince both North and South to seek arbitration. Instead of engaging in an armed conflict, is there not a way where people can sit down and talk about these issues and come to some sort of conclusion? So you have a sizable group of neutrals. Some of those neutrals were pacifists and believed that Christians should not be involved in warfare. Others simply did not take a position supporting the North or the South. They weren't necessarily pacifists, but they did not want to take a side. They wanted to maintain unity in the church. Others, usually the sectional influence had a big support for it. So that people in the North tend to decide with the Union, people in the South, out of the Restoration movement, tend to decide with the South. And certainly there were militants on both sides. Walter Scott, who had been largely a pacifist when it came to the war with Mexico, just 12 years earlier, 13 years earlier, had encouraged empathy for the enemy. But when the Civil War comes, Scott is very supportive, very vocally supportive of the Civil War, especially the idea of forcibly preserving the Union. The neutrals, of course, continue to push for peace and pacifism. they tended to be in that kind of middle region of the country, what are frequently referred to as the border states, or the mid-Atlantic states. So you have Northerners supporting the Union, Southerners supporting the Confederacy and secession, and then this broad group in the middle that are trying to hold everybody together. And again, some of it was, wanting peace or supporting pacifism, right? That continued idea of Christians are not of the world, they shouldn't be involved in the things of the world, so don't get involved in the sins of the nation. Even though, again, a lot of those leaders are anti-slavery, they did not believe that you should get involved in the war. Others were practically neutral. War was bad for the nation. Right? It would be bad for the church as well. So they're not pacifists. They're just against the Civil War. Others were pacifists because they believed Scripture taught pacifism. So Alexander Campbell is leading the neutrals, he's leading the pacifists, but he's getting older.
So Campbell was leading
He's on the pacifist neutral side.
Okay.
And he's trying to encourage others to take that same position, but and while there's many that are doing that, a lot of others are not. Additionally, a lot of those leaders, like Campbell himself, who are neutrals or pacifists, they have sons in the war. Right? So they're pacifists, but their children, who are of age, are serving as soldiers. So, even in families, there's division over this. But again, most restorationists reacted the way everybody else reacted. If you were in the North, you tended to support the Union. If you were in the South, you tended to support the Confederacy. So there were many young men from the Restoration movement who served as soldiers. Some of them served as chaplains to the various armies in the Civil War.
Some of the neutrals too.
No, some of their children. So the neutrals tended to be those older generation, but their children.
Children served as chaplains on both sides.
Well, yeah, some of them were, not so much chaplains to both sides, but you had some chaplains in the Union that came from this group, and some chaplains in the South that came from, not a lot, but most of them tended to be soldiers, one way or the other.
Now were the chaplains that served them, were they biased to that side?
Yeah, they tended to be the same kind of thing. You're a chaplain. I mean, there were a few. There were certainly some that served as chaplains who were still wanting to see the society, not turn to warfare. But a lot of them tended to be supportive of the Union cause or the Confederate cause, depending on where they were. What further aggravated the tensions were the policies of the American Christian Missionary Society. Now remember, this group had developed in the late 1840s as a larger institutional group that was supposed to bring about the cooperation of churches, especially in the context of missions. So the organization itself was supposed to be about cooperation. But there were a couple of things that took place in American Christian Missionary Society meetings that inflamed the sectional tensions. At this point, the ACMs, let's just abbreviate it there instead of having to say that every time. The ACMs is the only national organization in the group. There are no other national boards, national other types of institutions like you'd see in denominations that are kind of holding this together. So this is the only national group. And so how that goes is how it's going to affect a lot of these other situations. In 1861, as the Civil War is getting underway, several people from the Union side come to the annual meeting dressed in their new Union uniforms. Right? So these are people that are soldiers, so they come to the meeting in their uniforms, even though this isn't supposed to. It's not that type of meeting. One of those includes Colonel James Garfield, who will eventually become President of the United States. Yeah. So he's one of the people. The only president directly from the American Restoration movement.
Wasn't he assassinated?
He was assassinated after only like a month or two in office. Lyndon Johnson also had some Restoration movement background, and so also did Ronald Reagan. They were not members of either the Disciples of Christ or the Christian churches or the Churches of Christ at the time they became president, but they either grew up in those movements or had parents that were in those movements already. So Garfield was the only one to directly come from. He was coming from the Disciples to become president. There have been a lot of senators, representatives, and others as far as president. So he's there in 1861 in his uniform along with these others.
Okay, so he was a Union soldier.
He was a Union soldier.
Okay.
Well, one of the things that comes up in this 1861 meeting is that people in support of the Union wanted the society to pass a resolution suggesting that they were in favor of the war, that they were supportive of the war. Essentially, supportive of the war from the Union side, right? Because he could be supportive of the war from the other side. But they wanted the society to come out and say, we are in support of the forcible preservation of the Union through military effort. Right? And so they're trying to get this resolution passed. Now, at the time, in 1861, there is no significant presence of Southerners from the Deep South, which is where a lot of the early secession talk was happening. You don't have very many of those present at this meeting. And so, theoretically, the numbers are on the Union side. But not only is this a question of numbers, it's also a question of, disciples for the longest time, or Restoration Movement people for the longest time, had been separation of church and state. That it was the church did not get involved in state matters. It did not necessarily support the state. It was, the church is not of this world. And that's how a lot of those early members looked at this. And so to pass this resolution would work against that notion of separation of church and state as a movement. Now, certainly people were allowed their consciences on various issues, but as far as a movement, it had traditionally been separation of church and state.
This is from the disciples.
Yeah, well, I'm using disciples here to refer to the larger movement.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a resolution that's put forward, and this is a quote, that we deeply sympathize with the loyal and patriotic in our country in the present efforts to sustain the government of the United States. Right? So they're in support of the people that are loyal and patriotic. Notice what they're saying. Are the people supportive of the government of the United States. Right? And so it's kind of like anybody in the South that is supportive of that, they're not loyal, they're not patriotic. And we feel it our duty as Christians to ask our brethren everywhere to do all in their power to sustain the proper and constitutional authorities of the Union. So essentially saying, if you're supporting the South, you could not be a good Christian in their minds. Now, certainly we might say, well, there are other reasons why, maybe it's a question. But for the time period, this is a pretty bold statement for where the Restoration Movement was. To look at your brothers and sisters across the line and say, you're not good Christians if you are supporting the South, or that you have to support the North. At the time, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Isaac Arrett, another one of these important 19th century leaders. So he's chairing the society's meeting because Alexander Campbell is getting old, and so he wasn't able to be there, even though he's the president of the group. So Arrett says, you know what, that it does not seem to be something that we should do. Right? So he says, okay, that is a valid motion, and so we should take a vote on it. Other people feel, you know what, that's not the kind of statement that this group should be making. And so even though Eric says it was an okay resolution to put forward for the society to vote on, the other people say, no, let's not talk about it. So the appeal is successful, no resolution is passed. And so it's put forward that the society should take that position officially, but it fails. However, there was evidently an expectation that it would fail. And so there's some trickery done by the union side. So after this appeal is upheld, that the society should not be making those types of resolutions, a 10-minute recess is called. While the recess is taking place, so people are going to various places, you know, somebody else comes to the chair and calls for a vote. And the assembly, which is not technically legal according to the constitution of the society, right? I don't mean that it's a crime, but it's like the bylaws of the constitution of the society. This is not a legal meeting. They call for a vote on it and pass it. Even though they were not supposed to do it, even though it's not a legal assembly, they passed that resolution. The moderates and the neutrals are very upset about this. They condemn the actions. Say, it was inappropriate to pass the resolution to begin with, but then to use an illegal procedure, which I think is 5 yards. Illegal procedure is 5 yards. Yeah. so they're using an illegal procedure. Right. So they're using an illegal procedure and material. They said, right, it shouldn't have been passed anyway. And then you do this kind of bad way to go around it. Other regional societies pass similar resolutions, also condemned by the moderates. So you have a lot of these people that are trying to put forth these resolutions that the disciples or the restoration movement are supportive of the union. At the 1862 meeting of the society, there's no it goes by no problems. There's nobody tries to pass a resolution or anything like that. In 1863, however, a group of people that are very pro-union feel that the society, their silence on the issue is essentially support of the South. And so they prepare a variety of resolutions declaring allegiance to the Union and sympathies to the Union troops. And so those resolutions are passed, right, essentially condemning Southern Christians, those that are in the South. It led to a lot of the supporters of the Missionary Society who were neutral on the issue to question whether having a society like this was a good thing or not. And so you see division taking place here between some that are starting to say, you know what, this society, we shouldn't have even started it, and others being very supportive of the society's continued activity. Ultimately, a lot of this, of course, ends in some regional division. People begin to rally around their regional leaders. What religious papers are coming from the South, people are really supporting the South, are really supportive of. People in the North are really supportive of Northern papers, etc. In the North, there's also a movement towards more of developing a denominational structure. Out of this, in the South, there's more of a push for autonomy, believing that here you have this kind of national group, which isn't supposed to be any sort of official group uniting the churches, right? That they're trying to stay away from denominational structure, yet it is acting like a denominational institution. The North, very supportive of that move. The South, no, congregations need to be autonomous. And then you also see kind of the Northern Church, again, moving towards social action, while the Southern Church being more separatist. Questions or comments?
So South autonomy.
Yeah, that's they don't want those kind of institutions like the society making decisions for them.
And that's AUTONOM.
AUTONOM. Yes. I had to think about it. Yes. All right, we'll go ahead and stop there. There's still a couple other issues that are important for us to talk about related to division. We'll pick up with them on Thursday, but essentially I think you're seeing what is generally taking place. There is this sectional split taking place along this north-south line, and that also connected with this are economic issues, right? Where the northern part is more middle class, moderate, affluent, the southern part more lower class, conservative. And so it's not just a matter of theology, which we will get to. We'll talk about some of the theological divisions that are taking place.
So the South was lower class.
You have a lower class. As far as the people that were involved in this, a lot of the upper class people in the South are involved in other denominations.
Okay, and in the North they were.
You have more of the middle class.
Middle class.
Yeah, you have more of the middle class.
Okay.
All right, so we'll pick up with some of those other issues on Thursday.